My name is Greg, and I want to share a story that shattered my life in ways I never thought possible. I used to believe I knew my wife, Ellie, better than anyone else in the world. 10 years of marriage isn't something you take lightly. We'd been through it all: laughter, tears, building our dream home, even losing our first dog. Ellie always seemed like the kind of person you could rely on, no matter what. But what happened last week made me realize how little I truly knew her. It started as a normal evening. I came home from work after a long day, and Ellie seemed unusually upbeat. She was bustling around the kitchen, cooking something special, and the smell of apple pie, my favorite, was wafting from the oven. I figured she was trying to make up for how distant we'd been lately. Work, errands, endless phone calls. It had all created a gap between us that I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. "Greg, I have a surprise for you," she said, wiping her hands on a towel, her smile brighter than I'd seen in weeks. I raised an eyebrow. "A surprise? What kind of surprise?" "It's a party," she replied. "A small one, but it's going to be great. You remember Ben, right? He's hosting it, and we're both invited. All our friends will be there." Ben. I can't say I'd ever been a fan of the guy. He had this cocky demeanor and a knack for making jokes that crossed the line. But Ellie always defended him, saying I needed to lighten up. So, I didn't argue. The day of the party came, and something about Ellie felt off. She kept adjusting her dress, checking her hair in the mirror, and glancing at her phone like she was expecting a message. She looked more excited than I'd seen her in months. As we got in the car, I asked, "Why are you so nervous?" "It's just a party." She glanced over her shoulder, laughing lightly. "You overthink everything, Greg." Her response unsettled me, but I decided to let it go. When we arrived, the house was packed. The music was loud, people were laughing, drinking, and the whole atmosphere was lively. Most of the faces were familiar, though not many I'd call close friends. Ellie disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, leaving me by the drink table with a half-hearted smile and a glass of something I didn't really want. After standing there awkwardly for what felt like forever, I decided to go look for her. That's when things started to unravel. I wandered upstairs, where it was quieter. As I walked down the hallway, I heard voices coming from one of the rooms. One of them was Ellie's. The other was Ben's. I froze. Their voices were too close, too intimate. I heard Ellie say something like, "I've been waiting for this moment for so long." And then Ben's smug response, "Your husband doesn't have a clue, does he?" My world stopped. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing. It felt like my entire body had gone numb, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something deep inside me, some cruel force, compelled me to take a step closer to the door. The voices grew clearer. "Ellie, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. He's so clueless, Ben. He just trusts me." "Ben, that's what makes it so easy. You've got him wrapped around your little finger, Ellie. He's pathetic." Pathetic. That word hit me like a slap to the face. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my breathing steady, but I felt the anger bubbling up. I wanted to storm in there, to scream, to demand answers. But instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I leaned closer and peeked through the small crack in the door. What I saw made my stomach churn. Ellie was standing way too close to Ben. Her hands were resting on his chest, and he was smirking down at her, his hands on her hips. She looked up at him with the kind of adoration I hadn't seen in years, not directed at me, at least. I felt like an intruder in my own life, watching the woman I loved act as if I didn't exist. Ben leaned in closer, his voice low but clear enough for me to hear. "He'll never find out, and even if he does, what's he gonna do? He's not exactly the confrontational type." Ellie laughed softly. "That's what I love about him. He's so safe. But you, Ben, you're exciting." I couldn't take it anymore. My hand instinctively went to the doorknob, but I stopped myself. Bursting in would cause a scene. Sure, but I needed to think this through. What would I even say? How could I turn this humiliation into something that didn't leave me looking like the fool they already thought I was? I stepped back, my heart racing, and took a deep breath. I decided to leave them there, thinking I hadn't noticed. If they were this bold, they'd make a mistake eventually, something undeniable, something I could use. But I wasn't done. I went back downstairs, my mind spinning. The party was in full swing, and no one seemed to notice that I looked like a ghost. I poured myself a drink, hoping the burn of whiskey would steady my nerves. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and eventually Ellie reappeared, smiling as if nothing had happened. She walked over to me, placing her hand on my arm like everything was fine. "Having fun?" she asked, her voice sweet and innocent. I stared at her for a moment, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Yeah," I said flatly. "You?" "Of course. It's a great party." She didn't even flinch. The audacity of it was staggering. Ben appeared a few moments later, acting just as casual. He gave me one of his cocky smiles and patted me on the back. "Greg, glad you could make it, buddy. Having a good time?" I wanted to punch him right there, but instead, I forced a tight smile. "Great party, Ben." "Really?" Ellie glanced at him, and for the briefest moment, I caught something in her eyes, panic. She looked away quickly, but it was there. She knew I wasn't as clueless as I let on. I decided to stay quiet for the rest of the night, observing them, watching their every move. By the time we left, I had enough to confirm what I already knew. Ellie was cheating on me, and she didn't even have the decency to hide it properly. But I wasn't going to confront her just yet. No, I needed a plan. Something bigger. Something that would make them regret ever thinking I was safe or pathetic. The car ride home was eerily silent. Ellie sat beside me, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, occasionally humming along to the radio. Every sound grated on my nerves, but I kept my mouth shut. My grip on the steering wheel was tight, my knuckles white, but I didn't dare look at her. If I did, I might lose the composure I was barely holding on to. When we pulled into the driveway, Ellie finally broke the silence. "Are you okay? You've been quiet," she said, her voice soft and sweet. So fake it made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, not trusting myself to look at her for too long. "Yeah, just tired. Long day." She nodded, clearly satisfied with my answer, and leaned over to kiss my cheek. "I'm going to take a shower and head to bed. You should too." I watched her walk inside, her heels clicking on the pavement, her phone still clutched in her hand. She didn't even glance back at me. The moment the door closed behind her, I stayed in the car, staring blankly ahead. My mind was a chaotic storm of anger, betrayal, and humiliation, but I knew I couldn't let those emotions dictate my next move. I needed to be smart about this. Ellie and Ben thought I was weak, predictable, someone who wouldn't dare stand up for himself. Fine, let them think that. It would make what came next all the more satisfying. I pulled out my phone and started making notes. Step 1. Gather proof. I didn't just want suspicions or half-heard conversations. I wanted undeniable, irrefutable evidence of their betrayal. Something that would make Ellie and Ben squirm. Something they couldn't talk their way out of. That night, while Ellie was asleep, I quietly got out of bed and went to her purse. She always kept her phone password protected, but her laptop? That was another story. I opened it and navigated to her email. My hands shook as I typed in her usual password, the one she used for everything. The name of our old dog and her birth year. It worked. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe a few flirty emails or suspicious messages. But what I saw made my heart sink and my blood boil at the same time. There were dozens of messages between her and Ben. Some were innocuous, like party planning and shared jokes, but others were explicit. They talked about their secret moments at work, in his car, even in our home when I wasn't there. And then I found the pictures. There she was, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years, dressed in lingerie I didn't even know she owned. Some photos were selfies, others taken by Ben. In one, she was sitting on the edge of our bed, the same bed where I thought we shared a life together. I felt sick, but I didn't stop. I forwarded every email, every picture, every damning piece of evidence to myself. Once I had everything, I closed the laptop, careful not to leave any trace of what I'd done. The next morning, I pretended everything was normal. I kissed Ellie on the forehead before she left for work, and she smiled at me like I was the fool she believed me to be. As soon as she was out the door, I started making calls. First, to a private investigator I found online. I needed more than just emails and photos. I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. Then, I called a lawyer. I didn't say much, just that I wanted to discuss my options. By the time Ellie got home that evening, I was back to being the safe husband she thought she could manipulate. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone cheerful as she kicked off her shoes. "Good," I replied, smiling as I handed her a glass of wine. "How about yours?" She didn't suspect a thing, but I wasn't done yet. The days that followed were a masterclass in patience. Every morning, I would watch Ellie get ready, humming to herself as if she didn't have a care in the world. She'd kiss me goodbye, telling me she'd be late because of meetings or errands. Every excuse was a dagger, but I smiled, kissed her back, and pretended to believe her. Behind the scenes, though, things were far from normal. The private investigator I'd hired was already on the case, and the evidence was piling up fast. Pictures of Ellie sneaking out to meet Ben, receipts for hotel rooms, even timestamps that lined up perfectly with her late nights. But the real kicker came when I got access to her shared location through our phone plan. She didn't even think to turn it off. She was that confident I wouldn't check. I watched in real time as she spent hours in places she shouldn't have been. Ben's apartment, the same hotel she once told me was too expensive for a weekend getaway. The more I learned, the colder I felt. My anger didn't burn anymore. It froze. I was no longer the clueless, safe husband she thought I was. I was someone else entirely, a man with a plan. The hardest part was keeping up the act. Ellie was so used to me being predictable that she didn't notice the small changes. How I stopped asking questions, how I stayed up late under the guise of work, or how I barely touched the meal she made. She thought she had me fooled. One night, as she slept, I started preparing for the next phase. I went through the files the private investigator sent me. Pictures, text message logs, even a video of Ellie and Ben kissing in a parking lot. It was sickening, but it was also exactly what I needed. I compiled everything into a neat little folder labeled, "For Ellie," but I wasn't ready to give it to her just yet. No, I wanted the reveal to be perfect. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Ellie came home one evening, her face glowing with excitement. "Greg, you'll never guess what Ben's planning," she said as she kicked off her shoes. I forced a curious smile. "What's that?" "He's throwing another party next weekend. He said it's going to be even bigger than the last one. Everyone's going to be there." My heart pounded. This was it. This was my chance to turn the tables. "That sounds fun," I said casually. "We should definitely go." Ellie's eyes lit up, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The week leading up to the party was excruciating. I played my role perfectly, acting like the doting husband who couldn't wait for a night out. Meanwhile, I was coordinating with the private investigator and finalizing my plan. The night of the party arrived, and Ellie was more radiant than ever. She wore a dress I'd never seen before, one I could only assume she bought for Ben, and spent extra time on her hair and makeup. "You look amazing," I said, my voice steady. She smiled, oblivious. "Thank you. You're sweet." As we drove to the party, I couldn't help but think about how different things would be by the end of the night. Ellie thought she was in control, but she had no idea what was coming. When we arrived, the house was even more crowded than before. The music was louder, the drinks were flowing, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits. Ellie disappeared almost immediately, claiming she needed to say hi to some friends. I let her go, knowing exactly where she was headed. I mingled just enough to avoid suspicion, keeping an eye on the stairs. It didn't take long before I saw her slip away, her hand brushing against Ben's arm as they exchanged a look that made my blood boil. I followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention to myself. When I reached the second floor, I heard their voices again, muffled but unmistakable. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open, and there they were, Ellie and Ben, tangled together like they didn't have a care in the world. The shock on their faces when they saw me was priceless. What are you doing here?" Ellie stammered, her voice trembling. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. I looked at both of them, then smiled. "Don't mind me. I just thought I'd drop off a little gift." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a USB drive, holding it up for them to see. This, I said calmly, is a compilation of all your greatest hits. Pictures, texts, videos, everything. I thought you might want to keep it as a souvenir. Ellie's face went pale, and Ben's cocky smirk disappeared in an instant. You've been caught, I continued, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. But don't worry, I'm not going to make a scene. I just wanted you both to know that I know. I turned to leave, but before I walked out the door, I looked back at Ellie. Oh, and Ellie? Don't bother coming home tonight. Your bags will be waiting for you on the porch. The stunned silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. As I drove home from the party, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still coursing through my veins, but underneath it all, there was a deep ache, a kind of emptiness I hadn't expected. I had exposed Ellie and Ben, and I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was broken. When I got home, the house felt colder than usual. I went straight to our bedroom and began packing Ellie's belongings. I didn't care about being neat or organized. I just wanted her out of my life as quickly as possible. Clothes were tossed into bags, shoes thrown haphazardly into boxes, and anything personal, her jewelry, her favorite books, her framed photos, was dumped into a single pile. I left her suitcases by the front door, along with a note. Don't bother explaining. The evidence speaks for itself. Your keys are deactivated. Don't call me. By the time I finished, the exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as the events of the night replayed in my mind. Her lies, her betrayal, the smugness in Ben's voice. It all felt like a cruel joke. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of pounding on the door. Greg, open the door. Ellie's voice was frantic. I stayed where I was, sipping my coffee as if I couldn't hear her. She banged louder, her voice growing more desperate. Greg, please. Let me explain. You don't understand. It's not what you think. I nearly laughed at that. Not what I think. After seeing her with Ben, after reading her texts and emails, did she really think I was that stupid? Eventually, the pounding stopped, and I heard her footsteps retreat. I figured she'd give up, but a few minutes later, my phone started buzzing. She called. I didn't answer. She texted. I didn't respond. Finally, she left a voicemail. I hesitated for a moment before playing it, her voice trembling with desperation. Greg, please. I don't know what you think you saw, but it's not what it looks like. I was drunk and Ben. He kissed me. That's all. I swear. It didn't mean anything. Her lies were almost impressive in their audacity. Did she really believe I hadn't seen the months of messages and pictures? Did she think I'd forget the smirk on Ben's face, or the way she clung to him? I deleted the voicemail and blocked her number. For the next few days, I kept my distance. I took time off work, staying home to sort through my emotions and figure out my next steps. I started talking to my lawyer about divorce proceedings, making it clear that I wanted a clean break. No mediation, no second chances. Ellie, however, wasn't giving up. She started showing up at my workplace, waiting by my car in the parking lot. She even sent mutual friends to talk to me, trying to convince me to hear her out. Greg, one of them said, you've been married for 10 years. Don't you think she deserves a chance to explain? I stared at them, incredulous. Explain what? That she was sleeping with Ben for months? That she lied to my face every single day? There's nothing to explain. Word spread quickly among our circle of friends. Some were supportive, telling me I deserved better. Others were more neutral, unwilling to take sides. But there were a few, Ellie's closer friends, who accused me of being cold-hearted. She made a mistake, one of them said. Don't throw everything away over one bad decision. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A mistake? Cheating wasn't a mistake. It was a series of deliberate choices, and Ellie had made those choices over and over again. Meanwhile, Ben was noticeably absent. I hadn't seen or heard from him since the party, and I suspected Ellie had warned him to stay away. Good. The last thing I needed was his smug face making things worse. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, I got a text from an unknown number. Greg, it's Ben. Can we talk? I stared at the message, torn between curiosity and anger. What could he possibly have to say? After a few minutes, I responded, "What do you want?" His reply came quickly, "Meet me." I need to explain. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me wanted to hear what he had to say, if only to confirm that I wasn't the crazy one in all of this. We met at a quiet bar on the edge of town. When I walked in, Ben was already there, looking uncharacteristically nervous. His cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like guilt. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down. "Cut to the chase," I replied, my voice cold. "What do you want?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I screwed up. I know that. But you need to know, it wasn't just Ellie. She wasn't the only one lying to you." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. Ben hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ellie's been keeping secrets from you for a long time. And I'm not just talking about us. There's more things you don't know about." My heart sank, but I kept my expression neutral. "Like what?" He glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, then said the words that would change everything. "She's been hiding money. A lot of it. And she's been planning to leave you for months." Ben's revelation hit me like a freight train. My mind raced as I tried to process his words. "Hiding money? What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice low but sharp. Ben leaned back in his chair, avoiding my gaze. "Look, man, I don't know all the details. She told me she's been skimming from your accounts, stashing it away in a separate one under her name. She said she was planning her exit strategy." I felt the blood drain from my face. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't even form a response. The betrayal I'd already uncovered was devastating. But this was a whole new level. "Why the hell are you telling me this now?" I finally asked, glaring at him. Ben sighed, looking genuinely regretful, or at least pretending to be. "Because I didn't sign up for this, Greg. I thought it was just an affair, a fling. But Ellie, she's cold, man. The way she talked about you, about her plans, it didn't sit right with me. I figured you deserved to know." I didn't trust him. Not entirely. But something about his tone, the way his usual arrogance had vanished, made me think he wasn't lying. "Do you have proof?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "She showed me the account once. I didn't pay much attention at the time, but I remember the name of the bank. You could probably find it if you looked hard enough." That was all I needed. I stood up abruptly, grabbing my coat. "Thanks for the tip, but don't think this makes us even." As I walked out of the bar, my thoughts were a chaotic mess. If Ellie had been siphoning money from our accounts, I needed to find it, and fast. That night, I stayed up combing through our finances. I dug into every statement, every transaction, looking for anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't easy. Ellie had been careful, but eventually, I found it. Small, frequent transfers to an account I didn't recognize, all under a generic description that seemed harmless at first glance. The next morning, I went straight to the bank, armed with copies of our marriage license and other documents to prove I had the right to access the account. It took hours, but eventually, I got what I was looking for. A full statement of the account Ellie had been hiding. The balance? Nearly $50,000. My hands shook as I stared at the number. All those years of trust, of building a life together, and she'd been funneling money into a secret account, planning her escape. When I got home, Ellie was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. "How was your day?" she asked casually, not even looking up. I didn't answer. I dropped the bank statement on the coffee table in front of her, the papers fanning out like a damning deck of cards. Her face went pale as she saw what I'd uncovered. "What's this?" she stammered, her voice shaky. "You tell me," I said, my tone icy. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been stealing from me." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For once, she didn't have a lie ready. Ellie stared at the papers, her hands trembling. I could see the panic in her eyes as she tried to come up with an explanation. For the first time in years, she looked vulnerable, like someone who just realized their entire game had fallen apart. Greg, she began, her voice weak. This isn't what it looks like. I crossed my arms, my expression cold. Oh, really? Because it looks like you've been funneling money out of our accounts and hiding it in a secret one. Care to explain how that's not exactly what it looks like? She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, avoiding my gaze. I was saving for us, for our future. I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd get upset. I let out a bitter laugh. Saving for us? Don't insult my intelligence, Ellie. I've seen the messages. I've seen the photos. And now, I've seen the account. This wasn't for us. This was your escape fund. Her face twisted in frustration. Okay, fine. Yes, I was saving money for myself. But you've been so distant, Greg. You're always working, always distracted. I didn't know where we stood anymore, and I needed to protect myself. Protect yourself? I repeated, incredulous. You mean you needed to fund your little affair with Ben? Don't try to twist this into something noble. At the mention of Ben, her demeanor shifted. Her frustration turned into anger, her voice rising. You think you're some kind of victim here? Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere. That was it. The audacity, the sheer lack of accountability, was too much. I slammed my hands on the coffee table, making her flinch. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, my voice low but seething with fury. I worked hard to provide for us, to give you a good life. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with my so-called friend and stealing from me? Ellie stood up, her face red with anger. You don't understand what it's like to feel ignored, Greg. To feel like you're invisible in your own marriage. Ben made me feel alive again. Something you stopped doing a long time ago. I shook my head, disgusted. No, Ellie. What you feel is guilt, and you're trying to justify it by blaming me. But it won't work. Not this time. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said firmly. You're getting served with divorce papers. And before you even think about touching that account, I've already frozen it. Her eyes widened in shock. You froze the account? That's right, I said, my voice cold. You're not going to use my money to run off with Ben, or whoever else you've got waiting in the wings. You've taken enough from me, Ellie. This ends now. For a moment, she just stood there, stunned into silence. Then, without another word, she stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind her. I sat down on the couch, feeling both drained and oddly relieved. The confrontation was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. Ellie thought she could manipulate me, lie to me, and take everything I'd worked for. But she underestimated me. And now, she was starting to realize that her little game was coming to an end. The house was unnervingly quiet after Ellie stormed upstairs. I sat on the couch, staring at the crumpled papers on the coffee table, a strange mix of anger and exhaustion washing over me. I thought I'd feel better after confronting her, but the weight of everything, her betrayal, the lies, the stolen money, still pressed heavily on my chest. I knew Ellie wouldn't back down quietly, so I prepared for whatever she had planned next. And I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I woke to the sound of her pacing in the kitchen. She hadn't said a word to me since our argument, and I didn't expect her to start now. But as I walked in, she turned to me, her face a storm of frustration and fear. Greg, she started, her voice sharp, you can't just freeze that account. That's my money too. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. It's not your money when you stole it from our joint accounts, Ellie. If you want to fight me on this, go ahead. But my lawyer's already building the case, and the evidence is all in my favor. Her jaw tightened. You're being unreasonable. Do you really want to drag this through court? It'll get messy, Greg. For both of us. I let out a humorless laugh. Messy? You've already made it messy. Sneaking around with Ben, lying to my face, hiding money. What part of this isn't already a disaster, Ellie? She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. I'm done letting you control the narrative, I continued. You made your choices, and now you're going to face the consequences. For the rest of the day, Ellie avoided me. I could hear her making frantic phone calls upstairs, probably trying to find a way to salvage her situation. But I didn't care anymore. My focus was on protecting myself and ensuring she didn't take another penny of what I'd worked so hard to build. Later that evening, I got a call from my lawyer. "Greg, we've filed the paperwork, and she'll be served tomorrow. We've also flagged the account for fraud, so she won't be able to access it without triggering an investigation." Hearing that gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, I felt like I was regaining control of my life. The next morning, Ellie's world started to crumble. The knock on the door came while she was still in her bathrobe, sipping her coffee. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending not to notice as she opened it. "Ellie Matthews?" the man at the door asked, holding out an envelope. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "You've been served," he said, handing her the papers before walking away. She closed the door slowly, staring at the envelope in her hands. Her face turned pale as she read the contents, and then she looked up at me, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're really doing this?" she spat, her voice shaking. I stood my ground. "I told you, Ellie. This is what happens when you betray someone who trusted you." She threw the papers onto the counter and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door to our bedroom behind her. But it wasn't over yet. A few hours later, I got a call from an unexpected number. It was Ben. "Greg," he said hesitantly, "we need to talk again." I sighed, already tired of his games. "What now, Ben?" "Ellie's spiraling," he said, his tone serious. "She's been calling me non-stop, blaming me for everything. She's saying she's going to ruin you, drag your name through the mud. I thought you should know." I clenched my jaw. Of course, Ellie wouldn't take this lying down, but I wasn't afraid of her threats. "Thanks for the warning," I said curtly, hanging up before he could say more. Ellie could try whatever she wanted, but I was done playing her games. The papers were filed, the evidence was ironclad, and her lies were unraveling faster than she could spin them. As I sat alone in the quiet house that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was finally taking control of my life again. Ellie had underestimated me, but now she was the one left scrambling. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to smile.